How many years can a silence live inside a sealed box? It was small, made of old wood, with a lock that never had a key. It sat forgotten on the third shelf of her grandmother's cupboard, between scraps of fabric and buttons no one touched anymore. They used to say that time would carry away whatever lived in there. But time takes nothing. It simply sits beside the box and waits. Waits for the moment you stop running. Stop inventing new stories just to avoid remembering the old one. The woman in this story, no one knows her name but everyone recognizes her, carried a peculiar way of smiling, always with her eyes on the floor. She used to say that certain pains fade with the years, but on nights when the wind scratched at the windows, her body trembled as if childhood still lived inside her bones. The box remained, untouched, along with the unkept promise of forgetting. It was a heavy silence, the kind that settles on your shoulders even when there's no sound. A silence made of unread letters, words that died in the throat, memories stored as if they were poison. Outside, life performed its theater, dishes washed, bills paid, birthdays celebrated. But within her a room stayed locked, slowly molding with the humidity of absence. People would say, "Time heals everything." And she politely would smile. Not because she believed it, because it was easier to pretend. She knew time healed nothing. It only kept the wounds quiet, like beasts sleeping in the dark. Until one day, they wake and ask to be seen. That gray winter morning as the cupboard creaked open, the woman finally stood before the box. Time was there, sitting beside it, waiting, as it always had. She didn't touch the box right away. She stood there as if listening to a very old song coming from somewhere deep in the house. A scent slipped through the cracks, not mold, not damp wood, but the scent of something kept for far too long. The scent of words never spoken, of pain never named, of stories no one dared to tell. Time, sitting beside the box, said nothing, but its gaze was heavy, as if to ask, "Are you ready now?" She didn't reply. She simply knelt down, trembling hands resting on the lid. The cold wood seemed to recognize her touch, and in that silent gesture, something shifted. She didn't open the box, not yet. But she stayed. She looked. And that alone was different. She remembered being a little girl, dropping a glass in the kitchen. Her grandmother said, "Don't touch it, I'll clean it." But she did. She bled. And from that day on, she learned to leave the shards for others. Her life became a careful dance around the broken pieces of her past. But shards don't vanish. They nest in corners beneath the floorboards, behind the curtains of the soul. And one day, barefoot, you step on them. That morning, standing before the box, she knew she would step. Not because she wanted to suffer, but because not seeing had become the deeper wound. Time watched in silence, like someone witnessing a flower blooming through stone. It knew nothing would heal until she dared to see what waited inside. And she was beginning to see. The box opened slowly, as if it too feared what lived inside. There were no letters, no keepsakes, only a small mirror, dirty and dust-covered, resting on a piece of cloth that had once been blue. She picked it up gently. The mirror didn't reflect her face. It reflected time, and within it, she saw herself small again, sitting on a doorstep waiting for someone who never came. In the blurry glass, the hands of a child reached into the empty air, hoping for a gesture, a touch, a presence. None came. Only distant footsteps and the unspoken promise that one day things would be different. But that day never came. What did come was the skill of not feeling, of getting through days with a sealed heart, of laughing when expected and crying only when no one saw. She pressed the mirror to her chest as if trying to return to that child what had never been received. Her hands, now adult, trembling, worn, seemed to whisper an apology, not for the pain itself, but for pretending it didn't hurt. Outside, the wind changed direction. The trees murmured, as if bearing witness to a secret finally being revealed. The box remained open, But she no longer looked into it. She looked into herself. And what she saw wasn't ugly or broken. It was human. So deeply human it hurt with beauty. Time, still by her side, finally exhaled, as if it too had carried the weight for years. And now, for a moment, it could rest. Not because she was healed, but because she finally allowed herself to feel. And feeling, even if late, was the beginning of everything. That day, she began to walk through the house with her inner eyes. Each room seemed to hold an old echo, a memory that had hidden among the furniture. In the kitchen, laughter that no longer existed. In the hallway, light footsteps of someone who had long gone. The bedroom, closed for years, still carried the scent of a presence that never said goodbye. It was as if, by opening the box, she had also opened the windows of memory. But this wasn't a visit to the past, it was a crossing. Each memory no longer came like a knife, but like a whisper, as if saying, "I'm still here, but I am not your prison anymore." And with that, something began to shift within her. Like a house being swept clean from the inside, a house that had long been inhabited only by absence. In the mirror, now clear, she saw not only the child she had been, but the woman she had become. Not perfect, not resolved, but whole in her imperfection. The sorrow was still there, but it no longer screamed. It had become a scar with a voice. A story asking to be heard, not hidden. She sat in the armchair where her grandfather once napped, closed her eyes, and felt the walls of her body expanding, as if, by looking inward, she had found an entire house there, one that had waited for years for someone to enter without fear. And for the first time, she stayed. She didn't run. She didn't close the curtains. She stayed, with all that she was, with all that still hurt. And time, across the room, smiled, because it never wanted to take her away. It only wanted her to see herself. That night, she didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the half-dark room where familiar shadows moved slowly across the walls. The mirror lay on the coffee table, the box open beside it like a wound no longer hidden. She stretched her body across the wooden floor, eyes open, chest rising with deliberate quiet. The floor creaked beneath her like old bones, like memory itself speaking through matter. And something in the center of her chest, tight for so many years, began to loosen without explanation. Silence arrived again. Not the silence of suppression or fear or the long war of not speaking. This was another kind of silence, the kind that comes when all words fall short, when something inside has already understood. It was a silence that spoke first, before thought, before conclusion, and told her things she hadn't dared admit. That she had been holding on, that she had been hiding, that she had waited for someone to see what even she had refused to look at. She began to cry, slowly, then fully. Not with sobs, not with noise, but with the surrender of someone who no longer wanted to be strong in the wrong ways. The tears came from deep places, not recent wounds, but old silences, tears that had never found permission to fall. And now, they did. She cried for the girl who waited, for the woman who learned to pretend, for the years that had passed without witness. Every tear cleaned a room of the inner house she had never entered before. And as they dried, something inside her unclenched. Something sat down beside her, stayed. Outside, the world continued, unaware, unbothered. The ordinary hum of traffic, the night rituals of others. But inside this house, something holy was happening. Truth had arrived unannounced and found her unguarded, not fixed, not ready, but available. And time, older now, rose without urgency, walked toward the door like smoke. Paused for a moment and looked at her, not with pity, not with pride, just knowing. And without words, it nodded. Not because the pain was gone, but because she was finally home within it. She didn't move for a long time. The floor beneath her body held her like earth, like the first place she had ever belonged. Morning came slowly, without drama, slipping its light through the curtains like a secret. She sat up, bones stiff, heart soft. The mirror still waited on the table, but she no longer needed to stare into it. She had seen enough. Not everything, but enough. There was a quiet inside her now that didn't ask for answers. She understood without needing to explain. Not all pain goes away. Some things we lose are never found. Some wounds don't close. They become part of the landscape. But that doesn't mean we are broken. It means we are alive. It means we carry memory like water carries salt, changed by it, but not ruined. She didn't need the box anymore. She took it gently in her hands and stepped outside, into the overgrown garden behind the house. Beneath the tree where she once made stories out of leaves, she knelt and dug a hole with her bare hands. The dirt welcomed her, cool and forgiving. She placed the box there, not as burial, not as escape, but as a return, a gesture of trust, of release, as if saying, "I carried you as long as I could. Now the ground can hold you." She sat in the grass for a long time after that, not thinking, not searching, just being. And in that being, she felt something rise, not happiness, not triumph, but presence. The kind of presence that comes when you are no longer waiting to be someone else, when you are not trying to escape your own skin. Time by then had vanished. Not gone, but absorbed into the wind, the soil, the breath. It no longer sat beside her because it was within her. Not a healer, not a teacher, just a silent witness. She wasn't healed, but she wasn't hiding. And that changed everything. She stayed outside until dusk. The sky turned the color of memory, soft, uncertain, full of gradients that never quite chose a single hue. The air around her was still, but inside, something moved. Not a conclusion, not a solution, but a kind of rhythm she had never known. A rhythm without rush, without performance. Time never returned again, not in form, not in message. But its work was done. It had waited beside her long enough to see her take that first step inward. It had remained, patient, invisible, until she was willing to open what had once been sealed. It never asked her to be ready. It only stayed. And when she finally arrived to meet herself, time dissolved like fog in sunlight. Not vanished, just unnecessary. She now understood something only the long-living learn. Healing does not always arrive. And when it does, it speaks a different language. One made not of solutions, but of space. One that doesn't erase the pain, but allows it to belong. She left no note, only a gesture. The mirror remained in the house facing the window, and on the windowsill she placed a small stone with a single word carved into it. Not in letters, but in scratches. A word that meant nothing and everything. I remained. If you are reading this story, perhaps your box is also waiting. Perhaps the silence beside you is not punishment but invitation. Perhaps the pain is not in the wound but in not being seen within it. Close your eyes. Place your hand over your chest. Stay. Just for a moment. Time does not heal, but it waits, and so can you.